welcome to the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. This week, we're putting the spotlight on the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion, which just happened pretty recently at the end of November. And here to talk about it is the chair of the Religion and Ecology Unit for the AAR, Kimberly Carfore. Kim, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much. So thanks for the introduction. Yes, I'm the chair, but I'm also co-chair with Joseph Weeb. I want to give him a good shout out.
And he's also been on the pod. You guys were on together talking about this. It's kind of become something of an annual tradition where we have you come on and give us a bit of a report about what the conference was about, but specifically what the Religion Ecology Unit was and some of the highlights that you had. And so I guess maybe to start with, what was the location of the conference? What was the theme of the conference?
So this year, the conference took place at San Diego. And so the theme was, so just so those of you who are not familiar, the American Academy of Religion draws about 10,000 scholars from all across the nation and even the world to come together to talk about religion, right? So scholars of religion, religious studies, professors, even clergy. So today, or not today, this year it was in San Diego. And so the theme, every year we have a theme that is chosen by the president of the American Academy of Religion. And so this year it was violence and nonviolence. And so each unit chooses, when we're doing our call for papers a year ago, we choose, what we draw out dimensions of our unit and how that relates to violence and nonviolence. And so in our call, we kind of cast a broad net, and we were interested in papers specifically on the tension between, well, one of the themes was that we were looking for, and we got a whole panel on this, was eco-activism and the difference between slow violence and what you normally assume as violence, right? And so, and hate to start out, with the news, but the whole, the murder of the CEO is, to me, kind of represents the tension between slow violence and then what we normally consider as violence, right? So taking that lens and observing an eco framework, we could say that corporations are causing the slow violence of the natural world, but we, through our anthropocentric lens and our anthropocentric laws, we don't consider this as violent. And so our laws are not really assuming this to be violent, right? But when someone does an individual act of violence, that is considered violent. So that kind of play between violence and nonviolence was that line that we considered when we were looking for papers. So eco-activism was one panel. We had one panel on non-human sentience and sapience and kind of the role of violence and nonviolence, or the tension of violence, nonviolence through that lens. And that actually attracted a large amount of people. And so...
Right. And I got to say, for anybody who's not familiar, you're referring to the assassination of the CEO of United Healthcare, a prominent insurance company. And as of the recording of this podcast, early mid-December, that person still has not been identified. So yeah, that's really been very prominent in the news because some people have really been cheering on that violence. And of course, a lot of us activists and advocates for social justice or for environmental issues are always saying nonviolent resistance is the way, going back to people like Henry David Thoreau or Gandhi or Martin Luther King. And so it is a really big tension, and including in environmental thinking. So I really like that was the theme you guys picked up this year.
Well, it seems so prevalent. Thank you for clarifying that. And so I know you've had Heather Eaton on the podcast, and she's very much an advocate for nonviolence. But you'll see things like the throwing of the Campbell's soup at the paintings.
Right, on Van Gogh's Sunflowers. They threw soup on the sunflowers, which of course was a painting covered in protective plastic, and the activists knew they were doing no real harm to that.
True.
And that's the old distinction then between destroying property versus killing people too. In this case, they didn't destroy the property. Property was the target, but there's a big difference between ruining a painting and killing a person or making a species go extinct or destroying the atmosphere. Those are such different scales and types of violence.
Right. But then I think a lot about the Donna Haraway question, which is why are non-human lives assumed to be killable, right? You use the word murder. We don't murder animals, we murder people. And so intrinsic in the language is the uh, anthropocentric assumption that all human lives matter more than non-human lives. And so that was what I was interested in drawing out in the papers. And we sort of navigated, we sort of addressed that tension. But in the eco-activism panel, Bron Taylor, who is a big, religion and ecology person, is he the chair of the religion nature uh, chair
Uh,
religion nature in University of Florida?
I think he
Or
is
he
chairing the
was.
department. If not, then yeah, he was. But Nikkei is definitely a prominent member of it and has been very active in studying the intersections of religion with ecology, environment, nature, and of course, a big scholar of radical environmentalism too, and the activism that comes with that.
Right. And so in this panel, he was highlighting the history of environmental activism. And that panel also drew a big crowd. I think those two panels, the Sapience and Sentience, and then the religious environmental activism drew in big crowds. And he's been in the game, I think, 30, 40 years. And so this, he announced, was his last AAR. And he was just going off, and at some point he started getting emotional, and so I didn't mean to get emotional. And I know, God bless Ron Taylor. He's a very charged figure. I learned in the field. I was noticing from the feedback I was getting from the panel and the audience members. So it was a very charged room, right? And so when you have someone who's been in the field for a long time, kind of breaking down and going over the history and saying we failed and we've tried, so what's next, right? Basically expressing his hopelessness, right? And then we immediately moved into the business meeting, and then everyone's sitting there in this kind of like hopeless state, saying, okay, what do we do next? But I actually think that was a really poignant moment. And there were a lot of young people that stayed. And so it really felt kind of this charged energy of like, okay, well, what do we do now? Let's all brainstorm, let's think together. And I felt a lot of young energy that I wouldn't call hopeful, but I think sitting in that liminal space between hope and hopelessness, I think there's a liberation there. And so this kind of moves into next year's topic, because at the business meeting, we discuss what are we going to focus on for next year, right? What are some ideas? What are some themes that you want to see at next year's conference? And so next year, the conference will be in Boston, and the focus is on freedom. That's the next year's topic, right? And so obviously that's very prevalent for our current moment and political state in the election, and the ideas of freedom, right, are questionable. And so in terms of what were things that we were thinking about in the room and religion, ecology, and freedom, I think something that really stuck with me was Abby Mopat. She's very active, and she just is she didn't publish a book, but she was in a book, and they're rethinking kind of the future economies. Cynthia Mo Lobita, I believe, is one of the editors. So she was in the room, and she raised her hand and said, that there's freedom in hopelessness. And I thought, sometimes it's that classic line of it's okay to not be okay, right? Because I think it's important to be realistic in the field of religion ecology, but also maintaining some type of hope. And so I think about Joanna Macy's active hope. But yeah, I don't want to get stuck on this hopelessness, because I feel like we go there a lot.
Yeah, well, yeah, it is a very common theme because hope, of course, is a future-oriented feeling or, a virtue like faith, hope, and love for Christianity. So yeah, there's a reason people talk about it. I always think of the climate scientist Kate Marvel, who says we don't need hope right now, we need courage, and courage
Yeah,
is the ability to act in a fearful situation.
yeah.
And so, yeah, I really appreciate that. And I'm glad that the business meeting followed Bron Taylor's presentation because it seems like he brought up the right feelings that help motivate people to really care about the future of our work.
Yeah, the right feelings definitely rub some people the wrong way because who gets to decide what the right feelings are? And so I think
Yeah.
that emotion was definitely a little bit triggering, or that sentiment was a bit triggering, but
Yeah, I
that
like that. You
is
got to get the
fruitful.
people going. And
Yeah, it
otherwise, we're just
definitely
like, well,
did.
here's my research and stuff like that. It's like, well, this stuff really matters. And so
Yeah,
agree or disagree with the way he's expressing himself or the feelings he's articulating. It should be emotional. It should hit
yeah,
you at an existential level. And
yeah,
then that should motivate, I think, more engaged research, more bigger sense of urgency.
yeah, yeah,
And of course, like you were saying, talking next year about freedom, that's very relevant in the United States, where democracy is under threat. But of course, you think about Russia and Ukraine, and Israel's relationship with Gaza, or Lebanon and Iran, or current civil unrest in Syria. So
yeah.
this is a worldwide problem. Not to mention so many other places. I could basically list all the countries on the planet.
Yes.
Yeah, I really appreciate that that's next year's theme, and that you got some new early career scholars
Yeah.
motivated to keep engaging the field. It seems like it's one of the more popular units at the AAR.
Yeah, and I've said this on previous episodes, the previous year and the year before. So the different tiers, each unit is not graded, but we'll just say graded, right? Based upon its popularity or how many um, papers we get um, responded to in the call for papers and how many people come to our sessions. And so we're in one of the top, not the top tier, but the second to top tier. So yeah, we're very popular. And once again, and I get home after the conference and I get a few emails in my inbox of people that I didn't talk to at the conference that I've never met, and they're interested in co-sponsoring next year. And so we've talked about this in previous years that, and this is the integral ecological point that ecology affects every dimension, or at least the ecological crisis is allowing us or forcing us to rethink all of these different categories and fields. And so definitely that trend is continuing. Yeah,
Well, and it also seems like, speaking of how ecology relates to other fields, there's the other eco science, economy. And so
right.
the religion unit that focuses on economy is the class unit. And people have been pointing out the intersection of classism and speciesism and things like that for many years. So you did a co-sponsored unit with them, right?
Yeah, good segue. So, one of our co-sponsored sessions this year was with the class religion and theology unit, and that panel was called Alternative Paradigms and Social Movements. Well, that wasn't the technical title, but that was what we were talking about. And so, yeah, starting to think about how our ecological crisis is forcing us to rethink our economic situation and starting to creatively imagine what those futures might be. So yeah, we're hoping, we're definitely planning on co-sponsoring with the class religion theology unit in the future. Uh, it may be next year, maybe the year after that, but that has been a very fruitful partnership for us,
Yeah, that's
definitely.
great. And was Jorg Rieger part of that?
Jorg Rieger, yeah, Jorg Rieger and Tara Rowe, Tara's on the steering committee of the Religion Ecology Unit, and she's also running the extraction, uh,
Right,
what do you
energy and
call it?
extraction.
Energy and
Energy extraction
extraction.
and religion, maybe. Yeah, you always have
Yeah,
to add
yeah,
and
you have all
religion because it's
the,
the AAR.
exactly,
But yeah, that's
exactly.
exciting. And yeah, and Jorg and Tara have both been on the podcast, and yeah, just doing really great work, and really to
Great.
me exemplifying the future of the field in some ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're really getting down to the nitty-gritty of what this looks like. And it's such important work. Yeah, they just published a book and they were presenting on that book. And so they also gave a presentation. So on the Friday night, so the AAR goes, well, technically Thursday through Tuesday, but I showed up on Friday. And so on that Friday evening, they had it was called the Ecology, Nature, and Religion reception. And so they presented on their book there as well. So that was a really cool vibe. It was a really interesting venue. It was hosted at the House of Blues. And so it was such an interesting place to be doing scholarly work because we would be sitting there and they were honoring the lives of Forrest Klingerman and Ellen Bernstein.
Mm.
And so Elizabeth Allison gave some beautiful words, and so did Whitney Bauman. Evan Barry. I, most of them have been on your podcast.
Yep, all three of those. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, so they all gave some beautiful words and, and then in the background you'll hear some music just kind of bumping. I wasn't really sure what was going on in the other room, but it was one of the more unique environments that I've been in. And I believe I heard through the grapevine that Whitney Bauman chose the venue. So as you can
Yeah.
imagine, that would definitely aligns with
Hmm.
his uh his
His vision,
vision,
also
yeah,
his sensibility. Yeah,
sensibilities.
but yeah, I mean, many years ago, he gave a talk on bringing sexy back in the field of religion
Of
ecology,
course
which
he
of course
did.
is a reference to a Justin Timberlake pop song.
Which is not
And
sexy anymore, but sexy back then.
it depends on your age group, maybe, but even then, people were like, "Really?" And he was immediately regretting it. But I do appreciate that because
I do too.
making it sexy, making it fun, making it relevant to like stuff that young people like.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think that is really important, in even though it can be awkward sometimes. And I would think the San Diego House of Blues is going to be the one of more awkward venues, but really nice also
The
to
blue's
keep in mind
beautiful.
that these receptions keep going because, of course, there used to be a Friday reception
Yeah.
that the Forum on Religion and Ecology hosted, and then that stopped a couple of years ago. And then we were all kind of wondering, well, what are we all going to do on Fridays now?
Yeah. Yep.
And so to move it to these Friday night receptions and still keeping it going, and still trying to bridge these different communities. Some of the folks do the religious ecology work, some of the folks that focus more on religion and nature and all the tensions there.
Yeah.
But when
Yeah.
you're hanging out at the House of Blues, you don't feel those tensions. And you're just
No.
like, no, we're just a bunch of friends and colleagues who are trying to deal with ultimately what are some of the most complicated and urgent problems of our day.
And I think it's really important, and this is a question that I've had for a long time, being in academia, just and I so appreciate Whitney Bauman is how do you make it fun? How do you keep it creative? As you were talking, it reminded me of so before the business meeting, the religion ecology unit, chair members and the steering committee, we have our dinner. And so we met just to kind of hang out, get to know each other, have fun, just talk about whatever is on our minds. But then we also brainstorm about what we want to see in the future of the field. And so I kind of posed, you know, I just want it to be different. I want something creative. I want to bring some different structure, some fresh air, something nuanced or interesting, right? And I think balancing rigid academia, which is important and beautiful and it gets great work done at great thinking, right? But then also, how do we keep it loose and how do we welcome art? How do we welcome new ways of being and knowing? And how do we keep these conversations casual enough to where we open the conversation to people that don't normally feel welcome in those spaces? I think they can be very intimidating. And so that's something I've definitely cared a lot about. And I think us in the steering committee and I know me and Joe, co-chairs, we talk about this a lot. Like it's important to build community just as much as it is to do the work, because if you don't feel a part of something, then you're not motivated to continue doing the work. And there's a lot of people that join, right? A lot of people on the panels don't necessarily feel called to be a part of a community. But I think when you're doing work as going back to the emotionally charged dimension of this work, right? Um, this is a little bit of a tangent and I'll come back. So at USF, I hosted Christiana Zenner, who is on the the steering committee, and I hosted her at a talk at the University of San Francisco recently, and you were there actually,
Hmm.
and so she was talking about actually now I actually lost my train of thought.
Well, yeah. So I'm guessing it has something to do with a sense of community or the sense of the
Oh, right, thank
emotional
you.
component of this
And
work.
so yeah, at the end of her talk, she had a slide and it said, find your people.
Hmm.
And I just think that's so important, right? Find your people and do the work, take a break, and then when you need to reach out to them for support, then they're there, right? People who see the bigger vision, people who are committed to this work, right? So it's about finding your people. And you might not get to see them all the time, but it gives you the energy to continue because you don't feel so alone.
Yeah, there's a lot of these people that there's some I've only met on the podcast, like Tara Schwerin Rowe. I've never met her in person, despite the fact that she's currently teaching at my alma mater, the University of North Texas.
Oh yeah.
And or like Ricardo Rossi, I had on recently. He also teaches at the University of North Texas, but I left shortly before he started teaching there. And so a lot of these people I only have a virtual connection with. But when you feel the emotional connection and the
Yeah.
same existential commitments, then
Yep.
you really do feel a sense of community, and that's so important. And I also appreciate, of course, this was part of the University of San Francisco's kind of Laudato Si initiative, and because we're a Jesuit university, so of course we're focusing on this Jesuit Pope's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, which is all about caring for our common home and addressing ecological issues. And one of the things I also appreciate about Christy Zenner is in her talk, she was referring to other people we have invited to USF to give previous talks,
Yeah.
including most recently Philip Arnold and Sandra Bigtree,
Yeah.
and they were there, and of course both of them have been on the podcast as well. So it really is just one big happy family here.
I don't know if we're happy
Yeah, it's
all the
true. No,
time.
there's sibling rivalries and things like that.
Well, no, I'm not saying like amidst each other, like happiness. I'm just saying Christiana is so good with words, and I know she would have the perfect word for this emotion, but being committed to the work, and I feel happy and fulfilled, but I'm not smiling all the time.
Right. Yeah, it's a different
There's a
sense of happiness. I always
fulfillment,
distinguish between
purpose.
for some of the Aristotle, right, pleasure is not happiness, and hedone, pleasure, is different than eudaimonia,
Yeah,
which is happiness, and that's a sense of happiness as fulfillment. Happiness has more to do with purpose than
right.
pleasure.
Exactly. It's not like a hungry ghost trying to fill the void. It's no, that void is there, and
Hmm.
I won't lead with my hungry ghost void, right?
Well, and you know this, of course, as an athlete. I know you do long distance running, and that's something that makes you happy, but
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean you're smiling
Oh,
about
I'm
it.
not smiling when I'm run. Yesterday, I was not smiling on that run, but I'm sure I'm fulfilled. Yeah.
Yeah,
And the community, the running community is interesting, right? And
yeah,
thank you for bringing that up. It's very similar. You all feel the same sense of alignment.
yeah. And I know, of course, there is a religion and sports unit also at the American Academy of Religion, and I really appreciate that work. And especially for my students who are student athletes, I feel like that's one of the ways I can convey kind of what religion is about. Is like, well, it's like training for athletic work because it's not
Mm,
necessarily
yeah,
fun in the sense of
no.
like feeling good all the time. In fact, it hurts. There's no pain, no gain. So you need the
Yep,
pain in order to
yep,
gain more muscle and gain more ability and agility and all that stuff. So I think that it's
yep.
always a good metaphor. Like, look, we're playing in a way, playing a game, but playing sports, it often means really getting pretty hurt, and
Oh,
but the
yeah.
hurt feels fulfilling in a way, and you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself.
Well,
And
because you are, because if you
yeah,
get hurt, then you know you have the support system, whether that's your coaches, your fellow athletes, on your team members, or, the great structure of, okay, well, I'll just get this great massage after, right? The structure really kind of contains you. So I think this is a great segue. You're bringing up religion and sports, and I love the word grit, right? So this idea of grit. And so on my long runs, I've been listening to Mapping the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, and it's a podcast co-hosted by Philip Arnold and Sandra Bigtree. And so they were at the American Academy of Religion, and they are doing fantastic work. I recommend listeners to plug into their networks, whether that's listening to this podcast. So Philip Arnold just wrote a book that I'm also reading, The Urgency of Indigenous Values. And so it's interesting because oftentimes when people find out that I'm into sports, like, well, that doesn't make sense because of your theologian or you're into feminist theory, right? Don't those go against sports? But Philip talks about, I felt very supported in here, right? He talks about lacrosse, right? Lacrosse is an indigenous sport. It was indigenous before it got co-opted by Christianity, right? So the lacrosse. And so in the book, he talks about how kind of the cosmology of sports, how the way that we act in this world is, especially in sports, is pleasing to the gods because you're enacting these cosmological energies. and these real lived tensions in the with otherworldly beings. And so yeah, the work of Philip Arnold and Sandy Bigtree is amazing. And you had Sandy on the
Sandy was
podcast. Have
on
you had?
about a year ago. Phil was on earlier for this season, and in that case, we had a unique format where John Grimm interviewed Phil, because of course they
That's
both
what
do
it
so much
was.
Indigenous studies work, and live in relative proximity. So very close to East Coast Native American tribes, in contrast to my familiarity with more West Coast stuff. But yeah, so that was a really fun episode too. So yeah, we've had Phil and Sandy on, and yeah, they do such good work with their nonprofit, the Indigenous Values Initiative,
Yeah.
which shows how you scratch the surface of a lot of what goes on in the United States, and you find that it has indigenous roots. So even somebody's like, "Oh yeah, I play lacrosse in college." Like, well, do you know where that comes from? And then, of
Yeah.
course, in light of next year's AAR topic of freedom,
Yeah.
you think freedom politically, you think democracy, and then like where does American democracy come from? Like, oh, it probably comes from Plato and ancient Athens, or it comes from European Enlightenment values. Like, yeah, those are there, but largely there's this really prominent function of indigenous values at the core of
Yeah.
American democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's in the works. We don't have anything set in stone yet, but I've been speaking to Philip and Sandy and hoping to get a panel together on the Haudenosaunee and the um, indigenous law, right, around the Christian doctrine of discovery and domination, right? Because it is this ideology, this doctrine that it has justified the domination of Native American people, and like you said, so it's another example of it stealing this idea, right? American democracy didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like, it was this God-given, right? And those of you who are not watching, quotes in the air, right? A God-given idea. It was inspired by seeing the Haudenosaunee. And so even the feminist movement,
Hmm.
a book by Sally Roche Wagner, talks about how feminism, American feminism, the idea came from encountering Indigenous Native American communities because they were more egalitarian than American communities were, right? The women were
Yeah.
seen as subservient. And so when women engaged in these Indigenous communities, they were inspired to say, oh, I didn't know I was oppressed until I saw someone who was honored, right? If you think about the matrilineal clans and the way that they structured their government, it's
Hmm.
very different than the sort of patriarchal democracy that
Yeah.
American was founded by.
And we get so much attention given to Christian writers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and it's
Mhm.
often overlooked how much indigenous values were motivating people to care about women's rights and women's freedom.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm going to give another shout out because in terms of Indigenous values. So another really prevalent scholar, a colleague and friend of mine, her name is Uriah Seladwin. She just published a book. It's called Flourishing Kin, Indigenous Wisdom for Collective Well-Being. And so this is another book by an Indigenous woman who talks about these values and how juxtaposing them to Western values, it doesn't make sense, right? It's obvious we see the problems that we're facing, not just the ecological crisis, but when you really view the world through an Indigenous lens, view the Western world, then it's obvious that these are the communities and individuals and wisdom keepers and elders that we need to start really taking seriously.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's also strange to me, and this is, a separate issue, but how are Haudenosaunee values not Western when geographically they're part of
Yeah,
the Western Hemisphere?
fair.
And that's, I'll talk about that another time.
Yeah,
But the very idea of Western civilization, I think, is often very flawed. Even when you think of what we call Western religions, a lot of those come from Western Asia, right? And those,
hmm,
like where was Christianity?
right.
It's like, well, that's coming from like what we call present day Israel,
Yeah,
and that is Western Asia. And
right.
we consider Abrahamic religions generally Western, and yet sometimes people for Westerners like it's Jewish and Christian, but not Muslim. Like, but they're all Abrahamic, so it's weird that we separate those off. So yeah, the
Yeah,
whole West, East versus Indigenous, and like the whole way we think about this stuff geographically, I think often it overemphasizes some of our differences,
Yeah.
and ignores some of our similarities, and it just doesn't help line up. And it also erases the fact that there's a maybe bigger difference between ancient and modern civilizations than there
Mm,
would be. Like I think Plato might have more in common with Confucius than he would with like a modern philosopher like Immanuel Kant.
right.
And especially in seeing the world as enchanted, an enchanted universe.
Right.
That's a whole other thing. I'll put a pin in that and complain
Yeah.
about that another day.
Yeah. You should do a solo, like a podcast version on that, because I know that's
Yeah,
very
it's a
prominent in your mind and your
yeah.
research right now. And this is your research, not mine, but it seems like a handy term that people use to justify domination and kind of
Mhm.
the universalism of the dominator culture, right? You need a handy term
Yeah.
to try to
Yeah, you don't
create
start seeing people talking about Western civilization until the colonial era.
exactly.
And so it was used to justify European colonialism.
Yep. All right. Well, we need to hear more from you.
Yeah, I'll do that another time. Maybe in the new year, because
Yeah.
that's not a Christmas episode.
No, gosh, no.
Um,
Why are we talking about this? We're supposed to celebrate. I guess this is going back to Abby's point. I guess there's celebration in the muck. We have to
yeah,
learn to celebrate in the muck.
yeah. No, I agree with that. I think that's a good sentiment.
Yeah, well, especially because yeah, I'm not going to get into it. Well, here's a great figure, celebration in the muck. So something a panel I stumbled on, which was just a great kind of synchronicity was Judith Plasko, a prominent uh, feminist theologian, one of the key figures in feminist theology. She was inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame, and so they had a whole session honoring her in the evening. It was a little reception, and that was really uplifting and inspiring because I'll be honest, this AAR felt a lot different than other ones, and I couldn't pinpoint it. I wasn't sure if it's because, this is my third year as co-chair, and so the more I'm in it, the more responsibility I take, and the more people approach me with bigger issues or problems or dilemmas. Or, and I think it's probably both, and also a lot has to do with the election. I think people's sentiments just were not, it was very heavy this year, I will say. So
Yeah,
I'll
because
be
that would have been
curious.
what, just about 3 weeks
Yeah,
after the U.S. election, where of course Donald Trump won by what's ultimately a thin margin in terms of the popular vote. So yeah, I think a lot of people in the country were very surprised and dismayed. Not to mention people in other countries that are going to be impacted as well: Canada, Mexico,
right.
China,
We're
Ukraine.
also there. Yeah.
Yeah, and so yeah, I can imagine that that was pretty heavy. And I mean, it was the same with our students, right? That those couple weeks after the election, you could
That was
tell that
tough.
people were just like, okay. And
Yep.
I think even people who were happy about the election were still a little confused and dismayed because they're like,
Yep.
I don't really know what's even coming.
Right.
And so whether you voted for the guy or not, I think yeah, it was a heavy time. So yeah, not since 2016 have people had that kind of feeling.
Which
So, and I don't remember the 2016 AAR at
they
this point.
are.
It's such a
I don't
distant
either.
memory.
Well, and I think at that point I was on the steering committee, so it would have just been a very different experience.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to hold space for the whole unit and
Yeah.
other steering or other unit chairs too, because you obviously interact with other unit chairs
Yeah,
since you're a unit
absolutely.
chair.
A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. But yeah, so just finding Judith Plasko's induction to the Hall of Fame was a breath of fresh air. And it wasn't because it was this glittery, hopeful rainbow cloud experience. It was here's a woman who basically trudged through the mud and created the space for other feminist theologians to do their work. And I mean, she's hilarious. She has um, there were a bunch of scholars that were talking about how important she was for them. She was their mentor. And some girl talked about how, I apologize, I forget her name, but she talked about how Judith Plasko would be in meetings and then people would look at her and they say, "Man, you take up a lot of space," which, for a woman is very much something that we can struggle with is taking up space and feeling like we're taking up too much space, even though that to me is feeling our embodiment of our voice, right? Learning to embody
Hmm.
a more empowered and present voice and active voice. And so she has a what she calls a theology of excrement. So I just thought that she was such a great figure to think about, how do you do this work when you can tell it's really difficult, right? There weren't spaces for women theologians back then, and then she created them, and it had a lot to do with just grit and just showing up and just pushing ahead. And so I thought that that was a really great breath of fresh air. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course the irony of having a breath of fresh air in a theology of excrement, I do appreciate. But I suppose that's the point.
But that's the point.
Yeah, is that with our feet on the ground, amidst all of our complexity and the mess of it all, the muck of it all, that not only can you find happiness, fresh air, fun, community, solidarity in places like that, it's the only way you really can.
Yeah.
And by escaping our earthly entanglements,
Right.
even those that are most disgusting to us or unpalatable,
Yep.
or disturbing to our senses, that's, we can't escape that.
Yeah.
And so, fantasy is about colonizing Mars and things. It's like, no,
Exactly.
we're Earthlings and we
Exactly.
belong here. And hey,
Exactly.
if we want to be a multiplanetary species at some point, great, but we're going to have to do that from a sustainable relationship and just relationship with the whole Earth community. So, like, that's
Yeah.
priority right now. And that means dealing with things like excrement.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And of course, that's very similar to Donna Haraway talking about staying with the trouble, and
Yeah.
that, if you're going to find peace or happiness or justice, it's going to be here in this world, living with Gaia and all the mess
Yep.
of it.
Yep. Well, and it reminds me of, so this is a great story. So Christiana Zenner, she stumbled in the room and I saw her and we sat next to each other during the Plaskow um, induction. And then the reception happened, and so we went out and we stumbled upon Judith Plaskow. And Christiana was like, "Oh, I met you. You wouldn't remember me, but a long time ago, previous AAR, I met you in the bathroom, and I was, fangirling." And Judith looks at her. She goes, "Ah, the theology of the women's bathroom." And I was like, "Yes." And so I think, any woman who's been in the bathroom and you're crying because, whether you're like at the bar and you're drunk and some guy ditched you, or, you're in the bathroom because you're a waitress and that's the only place you can go to hide, or actually the cooler is the place that waitresses hide, right? So, but those moments when you're broken down and then someone looks at you and say, do you need, perfume? Can I give you a tissue? What happened? And they sit there and listen. Oh, well, you're better than that boy, right? So there are some of those moments of connection because, you're broken down. And so I think that's also just a great metaphor for sometimes these connections occur because we're in these vulnerable spaces, right? But it doesn't
Yeah,
happen all the time. It doesn't feel good.
I think that's an important lesson that especially people who are new to this conference or to conferencing in general might not know. And it's that a lot of the really special connections are in those kind of liminal places, the places
Yeah.
that aren't the focal point of the conference. The conference isn't like, hey, let's make sure we go to all these great bathrooms in San Diego. The conference is about people reading papers to each other, having coordinated panels, having
Yeah.
keynote addresses, and things like that. And yet, as important as those are, a lot of really special connections happen when you
Yeah.
bump into somebody in a hallway, or you bump into somebody at a restaurant or in a
Yeah.
bathroom.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, if there's anybody listening to this who is kind of new to conferencing, or maybe has been doing it a while but hasn't had as many connections as they want, I'm like, well, be open to them in those kind of spaces,
Yeah.
and because there's actually a lot, and I think probably less so in men's bathrooms than women's bathrooms because men are kind of just in and out. But certainly even then you're like, oh hey, and there's something that's a little more disarmed when you're in that situation, and
Yeah.
it's a little maybe easier to approach a scholar
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
kind of famous to you, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's yeah, great story.
Yeah. I have a story of an encounter with Mary Evelyn Tucker in the bathroom, and it was enchanting. And I won't give many of the details because it's sacred, right? But
Yeah,
yeah,
I do
as I'm
recall
thinking
that
of it,
because that was at CIS, right? The
yeah.
California Institute of Integral Studies, where you and Elizabeth Allison were hosting the Religion Ecology Summit.
Yep.
as part of the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program. So yeah, I remember that story. And yeah, we can leave the rest out of it, but because yeah, it is those are sacred spaces,
Yeah.
and yeah, another good example of how sometimes just a little encounter in a bathroom can really help a senior scholar give a junior scholar a lot of
Hmm.
energy
Yeah.
and some affirmation, like, hey, yeah, you're doing good work, and keep it up. And you're like,
Keep
well,
it
that
up.
actually meant a
I
lot.
see you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
writing a review of my book that praises my book might not mean as much as giving me some kind words in a bathroom somewhere with a face-to-face encounter.
The face to face. Yeah. Well, speaking of which, so face to face encounter, Philip Arnold randomly, it was at the end of a panel. You know, you're tired. You're listening and you're paying attention and you're trying to sleep well, and you're trying to socialize, you're trying to eat. And so, I was tired after a panel and he comes up behind me and he taps my shoulder and he goes, I have a gift for you. And he gave me this beautiful bag, Haudenosaunee Roots of Western Democracy, right? And so the wampum belt, so the symbol of the Scano Center. And that just meant the world to me, right? It's just that light, that that boost. You feel a part of a community. So that was a really beautiful moment.
Yeah, it's a great example of giving somebody some swag. They're like, oh, here's a tote bag that we have for the Indigenous Values Initiative. And you're like, this means the world to
It
me.
means the world to
Yeah,
me. I feel included and seen, and because in that moment you're tired, you
yeah.
just
No, that's a good one.
and it's
Um,
hard to feed yourself at these things. So
yeah, especially when a lot of academic work can be very isolating. A lot of activist work can be very disheartening when things aren't going your way. And so
yeah.
these kind of connections are often what really keep us going.
Yeah. It's important. I think this work can be isolating just because it's usually you in a book reading and trying to stay up on the field, trying to read everyone that's out there. And so those face-to-face moments are huge. And yeah, no, it was cool. I'm trying to think. I feel like there was another one that I wanted to share, but it's
Yeah, I know you had lots of stories. Well, including the fact that one of the great things about the AAR is also you get to see beautiful cities that have
oh, that's what
amazing
it
cultural
was.
history and natural history. And I know you, again, as a runner, got to get a run in along the water there in San Diego along the
Yeah.
Pacific Ocean and had a nice encounter.
Oh, it was perfect. So right encounters face to face with humans and also non-humans and taking time to connect with the place, right? I find that, and this is what I teach my nature immersion students, is as soon as once you get carbon involved, or fossil fuel involved, I always feel like it's really important to orient. Okay, where are we? What's north, south, east, and west? Where's the water? Who's around? And especially in these academic conferences, which can feel very rushed and very heady and very disorienting and very rigid in terms of time. You feel pulled in many different directions. And, for me, I didn't, prioritizing. It's like, okay, I always have to be there for all of the panelists. I have to be at every panel, the religion ecology panel. And then at one point, I was drained and I was like, you know what? I know feels counterintuitive because I'm exhausted, but I need to go for a run by the water. And so I pulled myself away from my responsibilities and put on my shoes. And at that point, because it's winter time, I think the panel ended at 4:30, and I was like, great. So the sun goes down at 4:50. This is very dangerous for a young white woman, but I just kind of kept staying by the hotels. So I was hugging the boardwalk, staying close to the water, staying by the hotels, just trying to breathe, right? I think breathing in the air, especially the air that's coming off the water, is really nourishing and kind of cleansing. And also just kind of getting that intensity gets me out of my head and out of the kind of rigid space and rigid energy that can feel very constricting in these spaces. And so I was like, oh, I just feel like stretching here. So I stopped and I stretched and I look over the boardwalk and into the water, right? So into the Pacific Ocean. I look down and on the rocks that are the barrier between the boardwalk and the water, there was this night heron, and it was the biggest night heron I've ever seen, and it was just so gorgeous. And it's just one of those magical moments where I looked around and it's not like there's a ton of night herons. There's no night herons, but the spot that I decided to look and look down, there was a night heron. And I've had some great moments with night herons here at the Bay Area, but this one was very needed, right? Just feeling connected to place, and even knowing that a night heron was hanging out on the boardwalk. I was trying to learn the species there in the short period I was there. I saw a few um, egrets, obviously seagulls. I had a few encounters with the seagull. One landed right on my window, and it was just hanging out with me one morning. I felt exhausted, and so that kind of gave me a little boost. Um, and then I kept going on my run, and as I was running, this little tiny bunny, like a little rabbit, just hopped over the rocks and near the water, and I thought, what the heck is a rabbit doing? It was a little one. It looked like a baby bunny. What is a rabbit doing on the boardwalk? Because it's just a bunch of hotels and then water, We usually see rabbits in forests. So I didn't know that rabbits hung out in near the Pacific Ocean in San Diego. So I learned a little bit about that. And there was one really beautiful patch of grass that I visited a couple times. I had breakfast there or lunch there a couple times. Yeah. It's important to, in these heady spaces, once again, to get my feet out and put it in grass. So
Yeah, right. That's what the kids say. Touch grass. Keep your feet on the ground. Have reality checks with the natural world. Go
yeah,
outside.
go
And
outside.
again, another important example that some of the really nourishing moments of these conferences can be in unexpected places, like just running along a boardwalk and encountering some wildlife.
Yeah.
Um, well, that's great. I don't want to keep you any longer. That was a really beautiful note to end on, especially not just for the American Academy of Religion in general, but for the Religion Ecology unit, to know that you could still have some lovely ecological encounters at these conferences.
Even in a city.
Yeah, even in a city. And so, next year will be in Boston, so I'm sure that affords just as many serendipitous encounters as any other place. And it's just a question of being open to them. Well, Kim Carfor, thank you so much for doing this again. We'll have to do it again next year. Maybe we can get some steering committees members to join you
Ooh.
and have a little bit more of a group chat. Um, but in the meantime, this was nice, and I always appreciate these reports from you. So,
Well, thank you for
normally,
having me.
yeah, oh geez, my pleasure, of course. And for the, I think like 5 years I've been doing this podcast, for most of them, I always end by telling any viewers or listeners to take care and be well. But I'm deciding to change that up now because I don't like having the last word. So if you could give us a word or a phrase, it can be just one word or it can be a phrase, and that will be the end of this episode. So giving you the last word, whatever it is, one word or one phrase, and that will help us wrap it up.
That is a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I mean, not really. This isn't that I think high pressure of an environment. It is
Okay,
just
okay.
a podcast
I got
after
it. You're
all.
right.
So,
Okay.
so one word or one phrase. Kim Carfor, take us out.
I would say honor women's voices and value Indigenous perspectives and communities and material